Okay. Hello. So today we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence, 4th of July, 1776. And we have come to our final subtopic of Area of Study 1. So this will mark the revolution, the end of the causes of revolution, and here with this document, the United States will be born, and everything that follows will be the consequences of revolution, or the consequences of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is the single most important document that we will look at in terms of the United States. Okay, so let's begin. This is also, just to make it clear, this is also the end of topic 5. All right, so the idea of independence. Now, we've already looked at this because it was mentioned at the Second Continental Congress, particularly by Richard Henry Lee, and it was exacerbated through Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which we looked at last time. So in this atmosphere, the idea of independence grows and becomes more and more encouraging, particularly at the Congress. Now, as the ideas in common sense were popularized and the voices of independence or for independence grew, through the spring of 1776, a faction within the Continental Congress, led by Sam and John Adams, as well as Richard Henry Lee, emerged. Now, these are amongst the most radical, and in that group is also Patrick Henry. Now, they began to push actively for a separation from Britain. Now, they did not believe reconciliation was possible, particularly after the failed Olive Branch petition that we looked at, and so began lobbying the more moderate delegates for their support for independence, particularly moderates like John Dickinson, to persuade him. And it was actually moving towards that camp in general in the Continental Congress, because of the failed Olive Branch petition and then the treasonous declaration of rebellion by George III. Now, between April and July 1776, so Congress started looking for foreign aid in its fight against Britain because, as you know, there's a war basically going on now. Now, we haven't looked at this yet, but this is happening because remember, 1775, Lexington and Concord conflict, so military conflict began, and then there was the siege of Boston. And now, moving into 1776, the war moves to New York. Now, Congress started looking for foreign aid because of this, to help them in their military struggle against Britain, who was trying to squash the rebellion and now revolution. Now, in Congress, there was a growing belief that this would come more readily once the colonies had declared their independence. So it's not just this general mood that's happening and that George III has said that they're treasonous. It's also to win the war and that other countries will acknowledge them. Independence is also encouraged because of that. Now, while Congress was the body that would declare independence, the move for independence needed to originate or be approved at a local level, as the delegates to Congress were bound to follow the instructions of their provisional congresses, which they represented. Otherwise, it wouldn't be democratic or Republican, which is one of the ideals that they are building their revolution on. So, thus, from April 1776, the colonies started to debate independence all over the colonies. Well, at this stage, they're becoming states, but they're still colonies at this stage. And they started to debate the risks and the benefits, particularly at a provincial congress level. Now, whatever these provincial congresses decided, the delegates at the Continental Congress would then lobby for or endorse, because that's their role, because they are representing their provincial congresses. So during May and June, provincial congresses started to advise their delegates to the Congress to start moving towards independence. Now, on the 15th of May, the Virginian Assembly instructed Richard Henry Lee, so he's the Virginian delegate, or one of the Virginian delegates, along with Thomas Jefferson at the Continental Congress, that they had unanimously resolved, quote unquote, that the delegates appointed to Congress proposed to declare the United Colonies free and independent states, absolved from all allegiances to the Crown or Parliament of Great Britain, that a committee be appointed to prepare a Declaration of Rights. So Richard Henry Lee introduced this motion to Congress on the 7th of June 1776, and this became known as the Lee Resolution, which is to appoint a committee to basically write a declaration. Now, as a result, on the 11th of June, Congress appointed a subcommittee to prepare a suitable Declaration of Independence, so basically to write one. And these are the members that were chosen to write the declaration. It is Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. So they're three key individuals that are on our study design, and then Robert Livingston and Roger Sherman. I guess the first three are for us the most important, and Jefferson became the principal writer of the Declaration, and the other four are more editors at this stage. Thomas Jefferson. In 1776, he was 33 years old, so quite young compared to most of the other delegates. Now, he's a Virginian lawyer and landowner, and he's renowned for his intellect and skill in writing. Now, he's also a member of the gentry, remember, just like Richard Henry Lee and George Washington, unlike John Adams or Ben Franklin or Sam Adams or Patrick Henry, which aren't gentry. Now, Jefferson is an Enlightenment thinker, and he's a committed patriot. And he's very familiar and inspired by the works of Locke and Rousseau. And later on, which isn't part of our timeline, but I'll just mention it anyway, he will be the third president of the United States, and he will be president for 2 terms. So, Jefferson as main writer. Now, Jefferson wrote the first draft. He was given this task by the subcommittee, as he was he had brilliant intellect, and he was a brilliant intellectual. He was also an eloquent writer, so he really had the skill of writing, and he understood political philosophy, particularly republicanism, and the ideas of the Enlightenment, particularly Locke and Rousseau. Now, his earlier writings included a summary view of the rights of British America, which he wrote 2 years earlier, which clearly articulated the case against the king and the views of the colonies and what they should do in terms of government and independence. Now, on the 28th of June, the committee, so the subcommittee, presented the draft to Congress, and then it was edited by Congress. Now, under pressure from the southern states, they deleted Jefferson's condemnation of the slave trade, as this could jeopardize the fragile Union. So, this is quite important because it will become important in area of study 2 when we look at the revolutionary ideals, if they were met, if they were achieved, or if they were compromised. Now, Jefferson, although he's a member of the gentry, does have slaves, or he did inherit them. He is actually against slavery, and he wrote this into the Declaration of Independence. However, the southern states are dependent on slavery, And at this stage, right, union and to win against Great Britain is their main concern, and that's why they delete this from the Declaration of Independence, because it might jeopardize the Union, and then the southern states might turn and side with Britain. So, because they don't want that to happen, they delete it, right, with the goal to revise it later, which they do and ultimately does lead to abolition, but that's not part of our timeline. Now, here's a short little video that you can watch. It's about, well, it's a film version of these three men reading and drafting the Declaration. You can look at this yourself. But here, there's Jefferson.
That's not what I intended, Dr. Franklin.
And they're discussing his...
Slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such. But I own that neither I nor any man has any immediate solution to the problem.
Oh, but 'tis no matter.
Anyway, you can watch that yourself. All right, so Jefferson's Declaration did pass, was accepted by Congress. Now, on the 2nd of July, 1776, Lee's motion for independence passed, so 12 votes to none. So it was basically unanimous. New York abstained, as they were yet to receive instructions from their assembly. That's why they abstained, and that's why it was only 12 votes instead of 13, but that is still considered a unanimous vote because New York did not vote. Now, then on the 4th of July, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was officially passed by Congress. And in the weeks that followed, the document was read before troops and in public gatherings throughout the colonies. So here is a short little video of the signing. Now you can watch that yourself.
It's all akin to political bands which have connected one with another.
You have Washington.
A decent respect requires that they declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Okay.
Becomes destructive.
You can watch
the right crown. Our lives.
All right. So the Declaration's key statement is the preamble, which is, you probably heard this before, but I'll just read that anyway. So, quote unquote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Now, this statement, our political philosophy underlying the colonists' assertion of independence, was the most significant part of the document, and within it, you will recognize the natural rights that they've been fighting for, so liberty, life, and property, and also that the Republican ideal that the government is the representative of the people and can only govern because of the consent of the people. So the consent of the governed, that's what it says. And this men is mankind. However, we will have to assess that in terms of women in area of study 2, which we will. What is also in the Declaration is the right to change government. So this is a very Republican ideal. Now, the Declaration also asserted the right to change governments. So quote unquote, from the Declaration, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. So obviously the people can do that through a vote, but people also can do that by abolishing it and instituting a new government. So basically the power is with the people and the government is there to serve the people, not the other way around. So that is also very, very clear in the document. All right. The United States of America is born. Now the colonies now recognized and saw themselves as the United States of America. A new nation was established. And the Declaration declared the USA officially separate from Britain and its empire. Allegiance to the king was now void. Hereby, the new Americans believed George III guilty of repeated injuries in legislation, so in terms of government and representation, judicial rule, so in terms of the justice system, military, and representation. Now, according to their natural rights and liberty, their perspective absolutely justified declaring independence, and it justified the existence of the United States of America, according to their perspective, remember? All right. Now, the charges aimed at the king, George III. Now, after asserting that the Americans had the right to change the government if it violated their rights, the Declaration then presented a list of wrongs committed against the colonies since 1763. Remember, that's when it all started with the Treaty of Paris and the Royal Proclamation Line. That's when their grievances started, and they thought the king and Parliament started acting tyrannically. Now, this included the interference in colonial government, the infringement on their rights, and waging war against the colonies by, the standing armies. So all charges were aimed at George III, who was accused of seeking to establish absolute tyranny over these states. Now, this is important to know and to remember, that the colonies did not accuse Parliament because Parliament did not represent them. It was aimed at the king because they see themselves as loyal subjects to the king, and they see that the king, as being the absolute monarch, has the power to change what Parliament did, essentially, and how they attacked the colonies. So this is what we have to remember. It's always aimed at the king. So let's have a look at some perspectives on the Declaration. Now, Richard Henry Lee, as you've seen before, on the need to declare independence, stated, to declare the United States free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the Crown or Parliament of Great Britain. John Hancock, as signed the Declaration of Independence, said, we must be unanimous. There must be no pulling different ways. We must all hang together. So he's saying, we must stand as one united states, and we must stay together to win this battle. So this revolution, particularly this war of independence, to secure our independence. And then obviously, if it doesn't work, we'll hang together. So he's talking about them being treasonous. Benjamin Franklin, when signing the Declaration of Independence, said, yes, we must all hang together. Almost assuredly, we shall all hang separately. So he's obviously referring to what they are doing as being treasonous and their treasonous act, but he's also referring to the Union, that yes, they must hang together, but if they fragment, then they will definitely hang separately. So he's also saying that we must stay together and fight this thing through together. So the union is really important, and probably the most important and significant to pull this through. Otherwise, if we fragment and become disunited, it is our downfall. And this is also one of the reasons why they took slavery out of the Declaration of Independence. So they're acting pragmatic at this stage. Abigail Adams, which is the wife of John Adams. Now, upon commenting on independence, she said, I like a little rebellion now and then. It is like a storm in the atmosphere. So she's obviously completely in agreement with the revolution and declaring independence. Let's have a look at some of Thomas Jefferson's perspectives. Now, on independence, he said, it is like blowing your nose. You might not do it well, but you ought to do it. Jefferson's perspective on the reasons for independence were due to a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period, so 1763, and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers. So he's saying, even though the ministers changed, Parliament and England kept on pursuing this oppression through the 60s and 70s, to plainly prove a deliberate and systematic plan of reducing us to slavery. So it's referring to everything that Britain did in the 60s and 70s, which led them to independence. Now, Jefferson's perspective on his draft, because remember he wrote it, and he said, never did prisoner release from his chains feel such relief as I shall in shaking off the shackles of power. So he's referring to the immense relief he feels in having written the Declaration of Independence and how free he feels. Obviously, liberty is highlighted there. Now, Thomas Jefferson's perspective on his draft being edited by Congress, which was, particularly the slavery parts were taken out and some of his words were altered. So what does he say? He says, my expression of the American dream, or the American mind, sorry, mutilated. So he's obviously not very happy about what happened to his draft. Now, Benjamin Franklin I was going to say on, not one, sorry, the editing process by Congress. He said, becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body is a peril. So he's saying, you know, you're not going to be happy if it's going to be openly discussed and edited. So he's saying being the draftsman, so being Jefferson, you know, isn't going to be the nicest feeling. So, and he's also highlighting there that, you know, the draft was altered. Okay, Jefferson's perspective on religious freedom. He says, all persons shall have full and free liberty of religious opinion. So remember liberty, so free liberty, so people can have worship and have any belief that they want in the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson's perspective on slavery. So quote unquote, there must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce, so referring to slavery, between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of unremitting despotism and degrading submission. So he's against slavery, says it's like an abominable act. And he says our children see this and learn to imitate it. So he's saying by continuing it, it's something that our Americans are born into and then think is normal. So he's against slavery and he's saying it needs to be taken out and amended. So his perspective is that it is despotism, it is degrading, it is submissive, and it has a bad influence on the manners of our people. It has unhappy influence, and our children see it and then they imitate it. So this is another reason why it needs to be taken out, otherwise slavery will continue. So what were the reactions to the Declaration of Independence? So, American reactions throughout the colonies. Now, the Declaration of Independence symbolized a turning point in the events from which now there was no turning back. So it's almost like the point of no return. Now, in Philadelphia, the bells throughout the city rang all day and night on the 4th of July. in Savannah, Georgia, the Declaration was read out at the Central Liberty Pole, and people toasted to a quote-unquote united, free and independent states of America. This was followed by a mock funeral attended, so quote-unquote, by a great number of people than ever to bury King George III. So in Georgia, on this day when it was read out, people didn't just read it out next to the Liberty Pole, but they also pretended to bury George III. So it's very symbolic. So they're burying their old empire selves, so their own old loyalty to the king, like it's dead and buried now. That's the symbolism. Also, Washington had the Declaration read out to his troops in New York because the siege of Boston was over and now there was war in New York. So this is where the center of the war was at this stage. It moved to there. Now, defiance was yelled at the British fleet in the harbour. The statue of King George III was also pulled down by people, as you can see in these pictures, in New York. So in the city, it was pulled down and then it was melted and turned into bullets. George III's reaction. So news of independence took 2 months to reach Britain, because that's the way it was back then. Had to make it across the Atlantic, you know, by word of mouth or letters. Now, George III was not amused, making harsh comments about the revolution that he always viewed only as a rebellion. So, remember, he didn't take this seriously. Now, George III's reaction of the Declaration is the rejection of the last link of loyalty, which the Olive Branch petition represented between America and the British Empire. So George III was determined not to see the dissolution of the empire. And because of that, he would not accept America's grievances, nor the USA as independent. So, as a result, he declared Congress and their declaration that it was blatant treason, and this had to be put down by war. So, what does he say? So this is one of his perspectives or his reaction to the Declaration of Independence. So, quote unquote, for daring and desperate is the spirit of these leaders. So he's talking about Congress, that they have now openly renounced all allegiance to the crown and all political connection with this country. It is necessary to prepare for another campaign, war. So that's what he's referring to. So it's the New York campaign, and now it's serious, and he seriously wants to destroy the revolution and bring America back under the empire. Okay, so what do some historians say about the Declaration of Independence? Farmer says the Declaration's purpose was to furnish a moral and legal justification for the rebellion. The preamble was the document's most significant part. Wood says the vision of the revolutionary leaders is breathtaking. As hard-headed and practical as they were, they knew that by becoming Republican, they were expressing a utopian hope for a new moral and social order led by enlightened and virtuous men. Their dreams and eventual disappointments make them the most extraordinary generation of political leaders in American history. He also says, the Declaration of Independence, a brilliant expression of Enlightenment ideals that still reverberate powerfully in the lives of Americans and other peoples today. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These truths seem self-evident even to 18th century Americans, divided by great distinctions of status and confronted with the glaring contradictions of black slavery. The Declaration of Independence set forth a philosophy of human rights that could be applied not only to Americans, but also to peoples everywhere. It was essential in giving the American Revolution a universal appeal. Brogan says Jefferson had produced a masterpiece, one of the great achievements of human spirit. It remains an inspiration to all Democrats today, and especially to Americans. That is because Jefferson, by a process like that which engenders poetry, was able to distill in his preamble as eloquence centuries of historical experience. These splendid assertions were indeed self-evident to the revolutionaries, to all Americans. How could they doubt them? They expressed attitudes which everything in their experience was settlers had tended to stimulate and reinforce. Whereas Howard Zinn says, so he's more critical, to say that the Declaration of Independence, even by its own language, was limited life, liberty, and happiness for white males is not to denounce the makers and signers of the Declaration for holding the ideas expected of privileged males of the 19th century. Surely, inspirational language to create a secure consensus is still used in our time to cover up the human race. All right. So, what's the summary of the Declaration? Due to the Lee resolution, drafted by a committee led by Jefferson and including Ben Franklin and John Adams, it was approved by Congress on the 4th of July, 1776. John Hancock's is the largest signature. Because remember, he says, that way they'll know, so Britain, who to hang first. Now, it outlined the grievances of dissolved representative houses repeatedly, like the Massachusetts Assembly through the Massachusetts Government Act and the Townsend duties. It also kept among them in times of peace a standing army without their consent, let's just say without, cutting off trade with all parts of the world, so the Boston Port Act, imposing taxes without their consent, so that's pretty much the Sugar Act all the way to the Coercive Acts, and it was directed at the King, George III himself. Now, it reflected the ideals of the Enlightenment. It declared independence from Great Britain, and it absolved any allegiance to the crown. That's it. So, I will see you next time. So, cheerio.